in the winter of 1864, on a secluded estate where prayer ruled louder than mercy, 4 masters died screaming beneath the hooves of their own horses, and the man who tended the stables vanished into legend, leaving behind a trail of blood, scripture, and whispers of something far older than revenge. Blackthorn Ridge sat on a rise of land that seemed deliberately removed from the rest of Hanover County, a stretch of earth where fog lingered longer than it should, and the air carried a damp chill even in early summer. The ridge had been settled in 1819 by Silas Caldwell, a man remembered in county sermons as stern, devout, and unyielding, traits that would come to define the family for generations. From the beginning, the estate was organized not around comfort or prosperity, but around control. The house faced east to catch the first light of dawn prayers, the fields were arranged with rigid symmetry, and the stable was built before the family chapel, an unusual choice that hinted at priorities rarely spoken aloud. As the Caldwell holdings expanded, so did their reputation. They were known for their public piety, their strict observance of religious law, and their refusal to tolerate dissent within their household. Children were raised under a regime of silence and obedience, taught scripture before they could read their own names. Family letters preserved in nearby parish archives describe a home where laughter was considered a weakness and curiosity a sin. Visitors often remarked on the oppressive quiet, broken only by the sound of horses shifting in the stable or the low murmur of prayer drifting through open windows. By the time Nathaniel Caldwell inherited Blackthorn Ridge in 1852, the family legacy had hardened into something almost ritualistic. Nathaniel believed suffering was proof of divine favor, and discipline a sacred duty. His household followed a schedule dictated by scripture readings, fasting days, and nightly examinations of moral conduct. Punishments were administered with cold precision, often after lengthy sermons delivered by candlelight. Neighbors noticed that no Caldwell ever attended social gatherings beyond church, and even then they arrived late and left early, as if fearful of contamination from ordinary human warmth. Superstition quietly wove itself into the fabric of their faith. Iron charms were buried beneath doorways, salt was scattered in corners of the house during illness, and certain psalms were recited only in whispers, believed to lose power if spoken aloud. The horses, essential to the estate's labor and status, were treated with a mix of reverence and fear. The Caldwells believed animals could sense moral corruption, and any horse that balked or reared was subjected to harsh correction, reinforcing the belief that disobedience, whether human or animal, was a sign of spiritual failure. The land itself seemed to absorb this severity. Crops grew unevenly despite careful tending, and storms frequently struck the ridge with unusual violence. Field hands whispered that the soil was wrong, that it remembered too much. Accounts from neighboring farms mentioned strange lights near the stables at night, and the sound of hooves moving when no one was present. These stories were dismissed publicly by the Caldwells as foolishness, yet privately the family reinforced their rituals, driving more nails into beams, reciting longer prayers, tightening their grip on everyone beneath their authority. Within this environment, cruelty became normalized, passed down like doctrine. The Caldwell sons were shaped by the same relentless expectations that had defined their ancestors, taught that mercy weakened the soul and fear preserved order. Their identities were inseparable from the land and its rules, and any challenge to that order was treated as rebellion against both family and God. Blackthorn Ridge was not merely a property, but a closed system sustained by silence, obedience, and an unspoken belief that suffering was the natural state of the world. By 1864, the estate stood as a monument to a legacy built on restraint and repression, its buildings weathered but meticulously maintained, its routines unchanged despite the war raging beyond its borders. The Caldwell name still commanded respect in church records and county ledgers, yet beneath that surface lay decades of accumulated tension, fear, and unacknowledged violence, pressed deep into the walls, the soil, and the stable timbers, waiting in the stillness of the ridge where nothing ever truly felt at rest. Samuel Crowe arrived at Blackthorn Ridge in the autumn of 1852, the same year Nathaniel Caldwell assumed full control of the estate, his presence recorded only once in the county ledger as an added asset, listed between livestock and tools. Nothing was written of his age or origin, only that he was assigned permanent responsibility over the stables. Those who later claimed to remember him struggled to describe his face with any certainty. agreeing only on his posture, straight, backed and unhurried, and the way he moved among the horses without the sharp commands or sudden gestures common to other stable hands. From the first weeks, it became clear that Crow possessed an unusual authority over the animals. Horses known to bite or kick stood quietly when he approached, lowering their heads as though anticipating instruction. He never carried a whip, never raised his voice, yet even the most aggressive stallions submitted to his touch. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in a low, rhythmic cadence that some said sounded like prayer, though no one could identify the words. At night, faint murmurs were sometimes heard drifting from the stable, blending with the creak of wood and the soft stamp of hooves. The Caldwell family regarded this ability with a mixture of approval and suspicion. Nathaniel Caldwell believed all order flowed from divine hierarchy, and Crow's control over the horses seemed to confirm that belief, though he could not explain it. The sons observed the stable master closely, noting that he never joined in household prayers and never attended church services, yet the horses remained calm, healthy, and obedient under his care. Rather than questioning the contradiction, the family interpreted it as proof that Crow's place was fixed and limited, useful but beneath concern. Crow's life at the estate was confined almost entirely to the stable grounds. His sleeping quarters were a narrow room adjacent to the tack area, sparsely furnished and perpetually cold. He ate alone, kept no visible possessions, and formed no alliances with other laborers. Those who tried to speak with him often reported an unsettling sensation, as if he were listening to something beyond their words. Despite this isolation, he seemed deeply aware of the rhythms of the land, adjusting feed and exercise schedules in anticipation of storms before any clouds appeared. There were rumors, quietly exchanged and never spoken near the Caldwell house, that Crow had learned his methods elsewhere. Some claimed he had been raised among people who believed animals carried memory, that horses remembered pain and obedience alike. Others suggested he practiced old stable rites, tracing symbols in the dirt before introducing a new horse to its stall, or tying strands of hair into knots and hanging them where only the animals could see. No proof of these claims existed, yet the stable bore subtle marks, small carvings on beams and doorframes that resembled nothing found in scripture. The Caldwells tolerated these peculiarities as long as the horses remained productive. Punishments administered to animals were frequent and severe when ordered by the family, yet Crow was often able to intervene, calming the beasts before lasting harm occurred. This quiet resistance went unnoticed or was willfully ignored, reinforcing the perception that he was merely a tool of the estate. In truth, his influence within the stable grew steadily, the horses responding to him with a loyalty that bordered on devotion. By the early 1860s, it was said that the horses would not move unless Crow was present, refusing commands from the Caldwell sons and growing agitated in their absence. This dependence was dismissed as coincidence, though unease crept into the household. The stable master remained silent, patient and watchful, his presence woven into the daily life of Blackthorn Ridge, an unremarked constant whose authority was felt most strongly in the quiet moments before dawn, when the horses stood waiting, eyes fixed on the stable door, as if expecting a signal that only he could give. Religion governed every aspect of life at Blackthorn Ridge, not as a source of comfort, but as an instrument of regulation and fear. The Caldwell family adhered to a severe interpretation of Scripture that emphasized punishment, obedience, and the constant threat of divine retribution. Prayer was compulsory and conducted at fixed hours, with missed recitations recorded and addressed through discipline. The family believed that unchecked emotion invited sin, and as a result, affection was discouraged, replaced by rigid formalities and silent compliance. The household day began before sunrise with scripture readings delivered in monotone voices, followed by labor assigned according to age and perceived moral standing. Nathaniel Caldwell maintained detailed journals cataloging infractions, both real and imagined, including improper posture during prayer, hesitation when answering questions of faith, or perceived disrespect in tone. These records were used to justify punishment later in the evening, reinforcing the belief that suffering purified the soul. The sons learned early that power and righteousness were inseparable, and that mercy was a temptation to be resisted. Alongside this strict religious framework existed a layer of superstition inherited from earlier generations. Certain passages of Scripture were believed to hold protective power only if recited in isolation, while others were avoided entirely, thought to invite misfortune. Mirrors were covered during times of illness, and windows were sealed at night with iron latches regardless of weather. The family chapel contained small alterations not mentioned in church records, including an iron cross embedded into the floorboards and symbols carved beneath the altar that blended Christian imagery with older, unacknowledged traditions. The Caldwells viewed misfortune as evidence of moral failure rather than chance. When crops failed or animals fell ill, the response was not compassion but intensified discipline. Additional fasting days were imposed, prayers lengthened, and punishments administered with greater severity. These practices extended beyond the family to those under their authority, reinforcing a culture where fear was synonymous with order. Laborers quickly learned that suffering was expected, and questioning its purpose was considered rebellion against both God and master. Children raised within this environment grew accustomed to silence and restraint. Laughter was corrected, curiosity suppressed, and individuality treated as a flaw to be corrected through scripture and discipline. Emotional expression was framed as weakness, and any deviation from expected behavior was interpreted as spiritual corruption. Over time, this repression fostered a household atmosphere thick with unspoken tension, where compliance masked resentment and obedience concealed fear. Despite their outward confidence, the Caldwells remained deeply anxious about unseen forces. Superstitious practices multiplied in response to this anxiety, including the placement of iron nails in doorframes, the burying of religious tokens beneath thresholds, and the recitation of prayers believed to ward off betrayal. These acts were justified as devotion, yet they revealed a persistent fear that something beyond their control threatened the family's authority. The horses, sensitive to these tensions, often reacted violently during prayer hours, a fact noted but never publicly acknowledged. By the early 1860s, the fusion of religious strictness and superstition had created a closed belief system that allowed no challenge and tolerated no weakness. Faith was no longer a matter of belief but of enforcement, a mechanism through which control was maintained and cruelty normalized. The Caldwells believed themselves protected by divine order, yet their reliance on ritual and fear suggested a deeper uncertainty, as if their devotion served less to honor God and more to hold something else at bay. From the earliest records, the horses of Blackthorn Ridge were regarded as more than livestock, occupying a strange position between tool and omen within the Caldwell household. They were chosen with care, often purchased from distant counties to avoid animals with known histories. Yet once brought onto the estate they were treated with an intensity that bordered on fear. The family believed horses possessed an instinctive awareness of moral order, a belief passed down through generations and reinforced by sermons that framed animals as silent witnesses to human sin. Training at the estate was severe. Colts were broken quickly, often before they were fully grown, using methods intended to establish absolute dominance. Any sign of resistance was interpreted as defiance rather than fear, and punishment followed accordingly. Despite this, certain horses never fully submitted to the Caldwell sons, reacting with agitation, rearing or refusing commands. These animals were labeled troublesome, their behavior recorded in ledgers, as if it were a moral failing rather than a response to cruelty. In contrast, those same horses displayed a marked change in temperament when handled by Samuel Crow. Under his supervision, they calmed almost immediately, their movements deliberate and controlled. Stable hands noted that animals known for violence would allow Crow to approach without restraint, standing motionless as he adjusted tack or examined hooves. This contrast deepened the family's unease, though it was rarely discussed openly. Instead, the Caldwells attributed the phenomenon to discipline achieved through prolonged exposure, refusing to acknowledge the role of gentler authority. The horse's refusal to accept other handlers became increasingly pronounced over time. Attempts by the Caldwell sons to reassert control often resulted in injuries, which were blamed on the animals rather than their methods. Whips cracked more frequently in the paddocks, and restraints were tightened, yet compliance only worsened. The horses grew restless during prayer hours, stamping and snorting as if responding to tension in the air. These reactions were documented in stable logs, but dismissed as coincidence or temperament. There were whispers among laborers that the horses recognized something in Crow that others lacked. Some suggested he listened rather than commanded, adjusting his movements to match the animals' breathing and posture. Others claimed he spoke to them in a cadence that resembled old working songs or field chants, rhythmic and low, meant to soothe rather than dominate. Though no one could confirm these accounts, the effect was undeniable, creating an unspoken divide between the stable master and the Caldwell family. As tensions escalated, the Caldwells began to view the horses with increasing suspicion. Animals that once symbolized strength and status now represented unpredictability and potential threat. Superstitious practices intensified, including the placement of religious symbols in stalls and the recitation of protective prayers before riding. Yet these measures failed to restore control, and the horses' allegiance to Crow remained unbroken. By the winter of 1863, it was widely acknowledged among the estate's workers that the horses would not move without Crow's presence. Saddled animals refused to leave the stable, and those forced into the paddock grew dangerously agitated. The stable itself seemed to respond to this imbalance, filled with an almost tangible tension, as if the animals were waiting for a signal, their loyalty fixed on the one figure who had never sought to dominate them, but had instead earned their trust through patience and restraint. The morning of March 3, 1864, began with a silence that unsettled even those accustomed to the oppressive stillness of Blackthorn Ridge. A dense fog settled over the paddocks, muting sound and reducing visibility to a few yards, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Thomas Caldwell rose before dawn, following his usual routine of scripture reading and inspection. Unaware that this morning would mark a departure from the rigid order he believed governed his world. Witness accounts from laborers describe Thomas walking alone toward the eastern paddock shortly after first light, carrying a riding crop and wearing his formal coat despite the damp cold. The gate to the paddock, normally secured from the inside, was later found latched in a way that suggested deliberate closure. No one recalled seeing Samuel Crow that morning, though the horses within the stable had reportedly grown restless during the night, their movements heard long before sunrise. What occurred within the paddock was reconstructed from physical evidence rather than observation. Thomas Caldwell's body was discovered hours later, broken and unrecognizable, bearing the unmistakable marks of trampling. Hoof prints were embedded in his chest and throat, the mud beneath him churned into deep impressions that suggested prolonged movement rather than a single incident. His riding crop lay snapped nearby, and his hat was found several yards away, pressed flat into the earth. The horse identified as responsible was a black gelding known for its resistance to Caldwell handling. When discovered, the animal stood quietly near the fence, its head lowered and its breathing steady. There were no signs of panic or injury, an observation that disturbed those present. The animal had not attempted to escape, nor had it damaged the fencing, reinforcing the impression that what occurred had followed a controlled, deliberate pattern rather than a sudden loss of control. The official explanation recorded the death as a tragic accident, attributing it to a startled horse and poor visibility. Privately, doubts emerged almost immediately. The pattern of hoof marks suggested repeated contact from multiple angles, inconsistent with a single animal reacting in fear. Additionally, the latch on the paddock gate showed no signs of struggle, and the fog, though thick, could not explain the absence of alarm or calls for help. Within the Caldwell household, the response was one of rigid composure. Prayer sessions were extended and discipline intensified, as if to ward off further misfortune. Thomas's death was framed as a test of faith, a narrative repeated publicly to preserve the family's image. Privately, fear began to take hold, particularly among the remaining sons, who avoided the stables whenever possible and issued commands from a distance. Laborers noticed changes in the horses following the incident. The animals grew quieter, their movements more synchronized, their attention fixed on the stable entrance, as if awaiting instruction. Samuel Crow reappeared later that day, resuming his duties without comment, his demeanor unchanged. No questions were asked, and none were answered. Yet an unspoken understanding settled over Blackthorn Ridge, that something irreversible had begun, and the order the Caldwells believed unbreakable had already shown its first fracture. Following Thomas Caldwell's death, the stable became the center of an unease that no amount of prayer could dispel. It was during this period that the first carvings were noticed, though no one could say when they had appeared. They were shallow and deliberate, etched into the inner beams of the stable doors where lantern light barely reached. At a distance, they resembled ordinary scratches from years of use, but closer inspection revealed intersecting lines forming circles, crosses, and angles that did not correspond to any recognized Christian symbol. Stable hands reported that the marks seemed to multiply overnight. A beam that had been bare the previous evening would show fresh cuts by morning, the wood pale and raw beneath the surface pitch. No tools were ever found nearby, and no one admitted to making them. The Caldwells dismissed the concern publicly, attributing the carvings to idle laborers or natural wear. Yet Nathaniel ordered the markings covered with tar and pitch, a decision that only heightened suspicion. Despite these efforts, traces remained visible beneath the dark coating, faint impressions that caught the light at certain angles. Reverend Morton noted in his private journal that the symbols appeared deliberately concealed rather than erased, as if their presence mattered, even when unseen. He remarked that the shapes bore resemblance to protective folk signs he had encountered in rural parishes, practices often condemned from the pulpit yet quietly preserved in isolated communities. Alongside the carvings, other changes were observed within the stable. Horses began standing in unusual formations, facing inward rather than toward doors or feeding troughs. Their movements grew synchronized, hooves striking the ground in measured intervals that echoed through the structure. This behavior was most pronounced at night, when laborers passing nearby reported the sound of stamping that followed a steady rhythm, rising and falling as if guided by an unseen signal. The Caldwells responded by intensifying their rituals. Additional prayers were conducted within the stable itself. Holy water sprinkled across stalls, scripture read aloud in raised voices meant to assert authority. These efforts had little effect. The horses grew increasingly agitated during such displays, snorting and shifting until Crow intervened, restoring calm with a few quiet movements. His presence seemed to counteract the tension, though the family never acknowledged this aloud. It was during this period that Ezekiel Caldwell claimed to have seen figures carved beneath the pitch during a late night inspection. According to his account, the symbols formed a continuous pattern running along the interior wall, interrupted only by iron nails driven deep into the wood. He reportedly ordered additional nails placed throughout the structure, believing iron would neutralize whatever influence was at work. The result was a stable reinforced with metal and marked with hidden signs, a place that felt less like a building and more like a sealed chamber. Laborers avoided the stable whenever possible, citing an oppressive sensation that settled over them upon entering. Some described a pressure in their ears, others a feeling of being watched. Lantern flames flickered unpredictably, and the smell of pitch mixed with damp hay created an atmosphere that lingered long after leaving. These accounts were shared quietly, never in the presence of the Caldwells, who viewed such talk as weakness or rebellion. As the days passed, the symbols remained, concealed yet persistent, and the horses continued their strange routines. Samuel Crow was often seen studying the beams in silence, his hand resting lightly against the wood, as if reading something written beneath the surface. He never attempted to remove the markings, nor did he add to them in any way that could be proven, yet his awareness of their presence was unmistakable, and the stable itself seemed to respond to that awareness, holding its breath in the dim light, waiting for the next command to be given. The disappearance of Samuel Crow was not marked by alarm or immediate search, but by a slow realization that something essential had gone missing. On the morning of March 15, 1864, the stable was found unattended, the horses already fed and groomed, their tack neatly arranged as if prepared by habit rather than urgency. Crow's sleeping quarters were empty, his narrow cot made with care, suggesting departure rather than flight, and no one could recall seeing him leave the grounds. An inventory of his belongings revealed almost nothing. A folded blanket, a tin cup, and a small wooden comb were all that remained. There were no letters, no personal effects, and no indication of destination. This absence of trace unsettled the Caldwells more than any sign of struggle would have. It suggested intention, a deliberate withdrawal executed with the same quiet precision that had defined Crow's years at Blackthorn Ridge. In the days that followed, attention turned to the stable itself. The horses remained calm, their routines unchanged despite the absence of their keeper. They stood in their stalls without agitation, moving only when prompted, as if awaiting a command that had already been given. Attempts by other hands to manage them were met with passive resistance, the animals refusing to respond without becoming violent, reinforcing the sense that Crow's influence had not ended with his departure. Reverend Morton conducted a final inspection of the grounds before the estate was sealed. In the stable master's quarters, he discovered a single object that had been overlooked, a scorched page torn from the book of Leviticus, its edges blackened as if burned deliberately. A strip of horsehair had been knotted through the page, the fibers tight and precise, forming a shape commonly associated in folk practice with binding or protection. Morton recorded his unease, noting that the combination of scripture and hair suggested an intention beyond simple devotion. Rumors spread quickly beyond the estate. Some claimed Crow had fled to avoid punishment, others that he had been taken by forces stirred within the stable. A few whispered that he had completed a task long in preparation, departing only after its conclusion. These stories varied in detail but shared a common thread, the belief that Crow's disappearance was neither accidental nor forced, but the final act of a design understood only by him. The Caldwells ordered a brief search of the surrounding woods, more to satisfy appearances than expectation. No footprints were found, no signs of travel, and no one reported encountering Crow on nearby roads. The search was abandoned within days, and the family turned inward, focusing on prayer and isolation. Their authority, once unquestioned, now felt fragile, undermined by the absence of the man who had maintained control over the most unpredictable element of their estate. Within the stable, subtle changes continued. The symbols beneath the pitch seemed darker, more pronounced, as if the wood itself had absorbed something left behind. Horses shifted their weight in unison during the night, hooves striking the ground in a slow, deliberate pattern that echoed through the empty structure. Laborers avoided the area entirely, convinced that Crow's presence lingered in the beams and shadows, guiding the animals even in his absence. By the end of March, Samuel Crow's name was removed from ledgers and spoken only in whispers. His disappearance became inseparable from the deaths that preceded it, a missing link in a chain of events that no official record could fully explain. Blackthorn Ridge remained standing, its routines disrupted but not undone, while the stable, quiet yet alert, bore silent witness to the departure of the one figure who had understood its rhythms completely. After the deaths and the disappearance that followed, Blackthorn Ridge did not empty all at once, but began to hollow from the inside. The remaining Caldwell family members withdrew from public view, their attendance at church irregular, and their presence marked by visible strain. Neighbors observed shutters closed at all hours and fields left partially untended, an unthinkable lapse for a family once defined by rigid order. The estate that had long projected authority now seemed to recoil from the world beyond its gates. County officials arrived in late April of 1864 to inventory the property, recording the deaths as tragic accidents compounded by wartime disruption. Their reports made no mention of symbols, rituals, or superstition, focusing instead on structural decay and labor shortages. Yet several officials privately noted the atmosphere of the place, describing an oppressive stillness that lingered even in daylight. One clerk remarked that the horses watched visitors with an intensity that felt deliberate rather than instinctive. Within weeks, laborers refused to remain on the grounds after sunset. Some claimed to hear hooves moving within the stable long after the animals should have been resting, the sound measured and deliberate, as if rehearsed. Others reported faint murmurs carried on the night air, blending with the rustle of trees and the creak of aging beams. These accounts circulated quickly through nearby towns, transforming Blackthorn Ridge into a place best avoided. The Caldwells attempted to sell portions of the estate, but no buyers came forward. Superstition spread faster than any official explanation, and the family's reputation shifted from strict piety to something darker and less defined. Church records from the following year omitted any mention of the Caldwell deaths, as if silence could erase the events entirely. The stable, however, remained untouched, its doors sealed but its presence impossible to ignore. By the end of the year, the house stood largely empty. Furniture was left behind, personal belongings abandoned where they lay, suggesting a departure driven by fear rather than planning. Travelers passing the ridge reported seeing lantern light near the stable on certain nights, though no one claimed to approach close enough to confirm it. These sightings were dismissed as imagination, yet they persisted with unsettling consistency. Over time, Blackthorn Ridge entered local folklore as a cautionary place, a reminder of what happens when authority is enforced without mercy and faith becomes a tool of control. Children were warned not to wander near the old road leading to the estate, and hunters avoided the area entirely. The horses, sold off in later years, were said to remain unmanageable, responding to no handler for long, their behavior reinforcing the legend of their origin. Decades later, the stable still stood, weathered and sagging, iron nails rusted into its beams and pitch peeling away to reveal faint carvings beneath. Those who dared to enter described an unsettling sense of anticipation, as if the space were waiting for something to resume. Blackthorn Ridge remained uninhabited, its silence unbroken. A place where the past did not rest quietly but lingered, shaped by cruelty belief, and a reckoning that left no grave marker, only the steady memory of hooves striking wood in the darkness.